Oh, darling.
Charles Darwin is facing one of his biggest crises. Annie, his 10-year-old daughter, is fighting for her life against a mysterious illness.
We trust in the name of the Lord, our God.
When nothing else works, in desperation, Darwin takes her to a hydropathic treatment centre.
Is there anything else I can do?
No, Charles.
As Annie's life hangs in the balance, it is a brutal reminder of everything Darwin has learnt in years of research. Nature, not God, determines who survives.
The whole of nature, when you look at it, not only is cruel, but necessarily has to be cruel as a part of natural selection.
For 20 years, Darwin has known that nature is ruthless. He sensed it during his epic 5-year voyage to the southern hemisphere. In New Zealand and Australia, he saw the devastating impact one invading species has on another. There had been strange animals like the Australian platypus that made him question how they were created in the first place. More disturbingly, he saw how people could be changed.
Astonishing. Truly.
Rules were being broken, and in the Galapagos Islands, the most dazzling prize of all, tiny finches that would change his life.
13 species.
13.
Unknown to zoological science.
Not only could species overwhelm each other, but perhaps could change from one thing into another. Darwin must now find the scientific proof to face his critics and bring his ideas to the world. Even his closest supporters, scientists like himself, have their doubts.
I won't abide progressionist bunk.
But these men will push and protect Darwin.
I need you to write a proper scientific abstract.
In the race to publish one of the most extraordinary theories of our time.
How's me Annie today?
It's 1844 and the quiet world of Down House is hit by a bomb.
Sit down, Charles, and do try not to scratch.
I can't sit down. I have a boil on my posterior.
Sorry.
It's all right. You didn't put it there.
Out of the blue, an anonymous author has beaten Darwin to the punch and published his own book on evolution, The Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation. But where Darwin is obsessively cautious to prove his theory, Vestiges is unscientific, full of errors, and worst of all, a bestseller with a public hungry for new ideas.
Might as well toss us in the fire.
Perhaps you might think of it as paving the way for when you publish.
It won't pave the way. It will give men of science all the more reason to dismiss my subject as hocus pocus. If that is what publishers want, a man is either in step with the times or he's out, and clearly I am now hopelessly out.
What does Mr. Hooker say?
He says it's a 9-day wonder.
Perhaps he is right.
Darwin was stunned that a book could be published in which so many of his own general themes, his own ideas of evolutionary theory, were explored in such a different way, except without the mechanism of natural selection.
It alternates between really very sensible and really rather brilliant hypotheses that there is a law of development, that beasts and men and animals and plants evolve, to quite wild and weird and crazy ideas.
In many respects, Vestiges was the Big Mac of science. It was something which was attractive, that people wanted to eat, and that basically all the serious people knew had absolutely no nutritional value whatsoever.
And he bought the mailing for you.
But a review from Darwin's former Cambridge professor, Adam Sedgwick, shows another side. The Christian scientific establishment is as determined as ever to crush anyone preaching evolution.
Who would dare to write such irreverent nonsense? Vestiges rejects the Word of God. This author tells our glorious maidens and matrons that their Bible is a fable, that they are born of apes and breeders of monsters.
Sedgwick thinks it's just a pile of rubbish. But not just a pile of rubbish, it's dangerous and it's immoral. It absolutely underscores for Darwin the danger of what he's doing.
Charles,
Yes, my dear.
what is it?
Nothing, my dear. Nothing at all.
Darwin has been secretly scribbling his own outline on evolution for 7 years. But after the shock of Vestiges, he now has no idea what to do next. He turns to the person whose judgment he trusts completely. The first scientist with whom he shared his early insecure thoughts about his theory. At 27, Joseph Hooker is well on his way to becoming one of the greatest botanists in history. Like Darwin, Hooker had voyaged to the southern hemisphere. He was part of HMS Erebus's epic adventure to the South Magnetic Pole. This 4-year journey took Hooker to the remotest parts of South Africa, Australia, Antarctica, and New Zealand. He was exposed to the extraordinary diversity of the world's plants, collecting thousands of specimens. On his return to England in 1843, Hooker quickly comes to the attention of Charles Darwin. Working closely together, he earns Darwin's total respect and admiration.
Joseph Hooker, as a young man, became renowned as a plant explorer. He documented plant distribution worldwide, studied fossils, and became known as the authority on plants at a global level. Hooker was the perfect foil because he had the detailed knowledge of plants and could tell Darwin about all sorts of trends in plant distribution that were relevant to evolution.
And it is Hooker who gets Darwin going again after the shock of Vestiges. He advises Darwin to specialise and intensively study one single species.
Joseph Hooker realises after Vestiges that Darwin has a credibility problem. He is a very broad-ranging naturalist of what is already becoming an old-fashioned kind.
To find a species to study, Darwin reaches back to the long-preserved specimens he collected on his southern voyage.
If he can study it intensively, if he can make evolution work, that really shores up his case. And in a second sense, it will shore up his credibility as a scientist.
Hooker's advice sets in motion one of the most significant journeys in Darwin's scientific life.
You really are the most good-natured man I know.
Oh, and you, my dear friend, really do live miles from civilization.
That's the general idea. How are you?
It is a vital step in establishing his theory of evolution.
Well, my friend, I've taken your advice and I'm going to study a single species of barnacle, collected on the Chonos archipelago, found embedded inside the shell of a mollusk living on a beach. And voila, I shall write up the barnacle.
Just like that?
Just like that. What would you like to drink?
Brandy.
Brandy?
Barbacles.
Barnacles.
What are barnacles?
That, my dear Willie, is what I'm going to find out. Now, we used to think they were snails or like mussels. Now we know they're a cousin to the crab.
But we don't really know much more than that.
The barnacles' work gave Darwin the real strength of knowledge of a particular group. It gave him an understanding of the varieties, the variation and adaptations that could happen in the natural world.
If Darwin can show that these natural variations occur in barnacles, he can apply it to all species. The barnacles hold the key to explaining how evolution works.
This is it, you see, using my eyes and fingers again.
So the challenge is essentially dissecting a pinhead.
What say you dissect these creatures at home at your leisure, and we'll compare notes.
Darwin's obsession with the barnacle isn't shared by his family. These little marine creatures stink.
You think I could make a bigger study of barnacles? No one's done it.
If it takes a fortnight to dissect one of these little monsters,
I'll
then...
get faster. I can knock this off in a year at the most.
One year will turn into 8 as Darwin throws himself into meticulous research, consuming every waking hour.
Down House became Darwin's fortress against the world. It also became his laboratory, the laboratory of life and nature, a place where he could do his experiments. He was a man with an obsessive scientific mission. He wanted to do nothing but work.
But Darwin's already fragile health cannot keep up with his racing mind. The symptoms of the mysterious illness, probably picked up from his southern voyage, have overwhelmed his life. At age 40, Darwin is a virtual invalid.
The barnacles were supposed to help you relax. Health is always affected by the mind.
You raise so many questions. What to do?
Annie, shall we say a prayer for Papa?
It's a bit of a conundrum that Darwin was so ill and yet managed to get so much done.
Thank you.
I think there's a combination of real physical disorder of some degree and a psychological stress. In the way that we now know, stress often takes a physical form in people. I don't think Darwin was imagining this illness. It was real, but I think the causes of it were in part mental tension.
The finest doctors in London have failed to find a remedy. Prepared to try anything, he turns to one of the latest alternative treatments, the water cure. The 2-month treatment of icy cold water seems bizarre. And for a while, his health actually improves. Though Darwin has more work to do, the barnacles are taking him closer to proving his controversial theory. He now feels confident enough to chance an opinion on what is now a 231-page essay. The one he turns to, Joseph Hooker, a friend and hard taskmaster.
To read, finally. Just when you have time. You know the general idea. Nature's way of making species. Yours will be the first expert opinion.
No pressure, then.
One of the things that's attractive about Hooker for Darwin is that he could put forward a theory and trust, first of all, that Hooker won't ridicule him or leak it to somebody, but will criticize it. But always it's not trying to stop Darwin, not trying to crush him. but trying to make sure that he's not putting forward a wild and silly hypothesis that will have him ridiculed and blown out of the water.
Darwin is making progress, but the late 1840s is no time to publish anything. The establishment is fighting for its life. The Charters movement is campaigning to bring modern democracy to Britain. But there are riots in the streets. One of the leaders is convicted of high treason and sentenced to be hung, drawn and quartered. Public pressure has the sentence commuted to transportation. Preaching survival of the fittest is to side with the revolutionaries.
1842, it's one of the most dangerous years in Britain. There were attempted rebellions in numerous places. Chartism is at its most militant. 44, it's still militant. 48, revolutions around the world. This is underscoring the fact that there's no way he can bring this subversive document into the light of day.
But it's not only the political implications that Darwin fears.
It's the scientific world that opposed evolution. Christian gentlemen of science, really great men, the founders of modern geology in Britain, stood foursquare against evolution. It was anti-God and anti-science.
Mr. Darwin.
These were Darwin's teachers. These were the men who sponsored his career.
Oh, Mr. Owen.
Darwin knew that these people would damn him or exclude him if he went public with his private ideas about the transformation of species.
Darwin's response is to throw himself deeper into research, gathering evidence to prove his theory beyond any argument. He sets out to study every single living and fossil barnacle available.
Hello, Annie. By Jove. Annie? I believe I've seen the most interesting barnacle in all the world.
What?
I think I've seen a boy barnacle.
To this point, it was believed that all barnacles were hermaphrodites, having both female and male sexual organs. But he sees some barnacles can change into a single sex. Like the finches from the Galapagos Islands, more evidence that species can change dramatically. The process of natural selection.
What is crucial is his discovery that the process of sexual generation, the process of producing offspring, is in itself produces inherent and inevitable varieties. He discovers that variations occur inevitably and perpetually in nature, and it's the study of barnacles that produces that crucial insight.
But Darwin's joy is short-lived. In the spring of 1851, his favourite daughter, Annie, falls seriously ill.
Hello, darling. How are you feeling?
Better.
Good.
Some trust in chariots, some in horses. But we trust in the name of the Lord, our God.
She's asleep.
Annie fails to respond to conventional treatment. Darwin decides to send her to Malvern for the same water treatment which has helped him. Emma, 8 months pregnant, is unable to travel the long journey.
I think we should let her rest.
Is there anything else I can do?
No, Charles. I'll come back at 7.
Thank you. My dear Emma, Dr. Gully is most confident there is strong hope. Thank God she does not suffer at all. Half dozes all day long. Our poor child has been fearfully ill as a human being could be. I will write again if I can anyhow see Dr. Gully before 7 o'clock.
Willie. Where's Willie?
Papa's here, Annie, darling. Papa's here.
Papa. Don't worry, Papa. Bad for your stomach.
Annie? Annie, darling? Annie? Annie? Annie?
Annie is buried the next day in Malvern, and Darwin returns to Down House.
I thought when I heard the carriage that perhaps it was a dream,
And she'd come dancing in. I can see her, I know.
Dear Lord Charles, what are we to do?
Dr. Gully gave me his report.
Good. Yes.
Bilious fever with typhoid character.
I see. And at the end?
Tranquil. Very tranquil.
Oh, poor little girl. Now it is the angels who will be looking after her.
Darwin sees Annie's death as a tragic reminder of natural selection. Only the strong survive, and nature, not God, decides her fate like that of any other animal.
The whole of nature, when you look at it, not only is cruel, but necessarily has to be cruel as a part of natural selection. After she died, I think not only the light went out of his life, but also it was part of what killed religion for him.
This perfect specimen of humanity was crushed in the struggle for existence. And I think nothing could have driven home for Darwin more the tragedy of his vision of natural selection. That which we love is taken from us. That nature doesn't respect our hopes and desires.
Times are changing. In 1851, Britain celebrates the opening of the Great Exhibition. In a specially built modern glass wonder called the Crystal Palace, Britain's marvel at exhibits showing the accomplishments of her factories and colonies. It is the turning point of the Victorian age. A huge leap in progress that came with the Industrial Revolution. This is a Britain re-energised by opportunity, in a mood to celebrate science. The man who would eventually come to embody this era and be a vital supporter of Charles Darwin is Thomas Huxley.
Huxley was the most charismatic figure in the middle of the 19th century. He was amazingly witty, clever, and very confrontational.
If I must make a choice,
Huxley, like Darwin and Joseph Hooker before him, had made a journey to the southern seas. He was employed as a lowly paid surgeon's mate on HMS Rattlesnake. Its mission was to survey New Guinea and Australia's Great Barrier Reef. It was a 4-year voyage which would not only turn him into a brilliant marine biologist, but find him a wife. In July 1847, the Rattlesnake arrived in Sydney, where Huxley met 22-year-old colonial Henrietta Heathorn. It was love at first sight. They were engaged after only a few meetings, but Hetty has no prospects, and nor does Huxley.
3 years. By then I'm either established as a scientist in Britain, or I come here to find work.
You will be a great scientist. I know it.
I want to take science to the working classes. Progressive science education to ready them for the day they take control.
I know, and you will. And in 3 years' time, I shall be there by your side.
Huxley returned to England in 1850. But 2 years later, this debt-ridden 27-year-old has still yet to find a paying position in science.
When Huxley arrives back in London, his experience is the very opposite of Darwin's. There's nobody to greet him and say, "You're a coming man." He really is an outsider. Huxley belongs to the struggling middling class. He's incredibly angry. He is a kind of potential bomb thrower. I mean, if Huxley had been blocked permanently, I think he would have been a political radical of the highest order.
Huxley pours his frustrations into a deep loathing of one man who seems to have it all, the head of Britain's scientific establishment.
Richard Owen was an extraordinary naturalist. He had a great deal of power. He dispensed patronage. He had aristocratic connections. He was condescending. And he believed that new species could come about by a sort of inspiration of God.
Thomas Huxley sees Owen as just a social blockage, as a complete manipulator, as a person self-promoting. He sees him almost as immoral.
Made worse as Huxley needs a reference from Owen.
Mr. Huxley, I've received your note, and I've decided to grant it.
The decision changes nothing. Huxley is determined to destroy Owen and change the scientific establishment.
So you've met Huxley. You and I are in correspondence. He's done some excellent work on oceanic hydrozoa. Some mercurial-minded work.
We shared tales of demented ship captains.
No shortage of material there.
Well, he's a rising star, in rather desperate need of a paying position.
Well, he's certainly been pushing me to think hard.
And he's got Owen in his sights. He's a materialist, of course, a strong secularist.
And his character?
Well, let's just put it this way. If you were in a fight, he's the chap you'd want on your side.
As was typical with Darwin, he and Huxley established their relationship through letters, meeting a year later in 1853.
Thomas Huxley, Charles Darwin.
By then, Huxley has found a paying position.
I knew you'd have hard hands, sir. The mark of an old salt. All that bracing of the yards. Don't we miss it, sirs?
No. These three men had had their science and their values forged together. And I think that bond of the salt, as he talks about it, the Freemasonry of being a sailor, these things are tremendously important in forging the relationship and friendship between these three.
And this is very indelicate, but it would give me great pleasure to see my latest barnacle book to be reviewed by someone so capable. If you would, sir.
I'm sure it would be a pleasure. As opposed to the cant this lot churns out. In this place, the brainless thrive.
That was rather pushy of me.
It's about time.
Charles. Sir Charles, I see your geology is in its 9th edition. 9th. Congratulations.
Why, thank you. I shall bring you a copy when we come down for the weekend. Now, that's a threat.
The visit or the book?
We shall do some work, Charles. Another threat. Give my best to Emma, will you?
The support of Charles Lyell, Hooker and Huxley will be crucial to Darwin's future. But the burden of proof continues for Darwin. His relentless study of barnacles showed him how one species can change. Now he must test how natural selection works in all of nature. His thoughts return to the southern hemisphere, where the idea of natural selection first began.
Darwin sees it as a theory that produces new species and causes extinctions all the time. It produces new advantages, but it is a process of continual struggle for existence, and as would later be said, survival of the fittest.
Darwin thinks the animals that he encountered may hold the key to how one species can evolve into another. He questioned why the platypus looked so familiar.
They were diving and playing about the surface of the water so that they might easily have been mistaken for many water rats. Crows, like our jackdaws, were not uncommon. And another bird. Something like the magpie.
And it's the same with plants. They are often similar to those in the northern hemisphere.
English grasses.
But the question is, how did they get there? The scientific belief of the day is that God not only created every single species, but that he placed them as he saw fit in just one particular place. But Darwin believes that species of plants and animals evolved through natural means. And in the competition to survive in new environments, those same species eventually modify to form new species.
When you begin to think that, in fact, the environmental conditions in some way impinged on our hereditary material and favored one set of genes over another, then it begins to make sense. That's how they began to diverge. That's why they're different, because of the environmental conditions that act to basically filter out or winnow out those combinations of genes that were less fit.
But what Darwin has yet to prove is, how do plants and animals move to new environments around the world? In unlocking these puzzles, Darwin finds the crucial evidence he desperately needs to prove how evolution and natural selection works.
Working as he did in the middle of the 19th century, Darwin was lacking in an awful lot of the knowledge that we have today. Given that, it's astonishing how far he got. There's very little in it you could say was actually wrong. His mind was a kind of machine for grinding out theories from facts. Darwin's huge knowledge of natural history, gained from personal experience and from reading, brought together what he needed in order to think of ideas and to test his ideas against the facts.
By 1855, Darwin has turned Down House into one huge laboratory. He undertakes a series of intriguing experiments. He thinks laterally to show exactly how animals and plants could migrate around the world and then evolve into new species.
Darwin's plant experiments were simply to immerse seeds in salty water and see how long the seed survived before it failed to germinate. A beautifully elegant experiment. If a seed could live for 100 days, that would suggest it could drift across the ocean for that period of time and maybe get from one island to the other.
Papa, Chris, lettuce! In 21 days.
That's right, George.
And Mr. Hooker said we couldn't do it.
Fighting a battle with Mr. Hooker always clears the mind. Now, George.
With flightless animals like snails, Darwin thinks they might just catch a ride on the limbs of birds, like duck's feet.
Now, Mr. Duck's flying with the snails catching a ride. Let's see how many cling on and how many fall.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12.
And how many have we left? 1, 2,
3, 4.
While Darwin continues his experiments, he meticulously gathers evidence by a relentless writing campaign to the hundreds of naturalists around the world. He requests animal and plant specimens, along with detailed notes on their habits and histories. Bird skins from Sarawak, skeletons from India, Asian cat's ears, species of bean from Norway, and closer to home, lizard eggs from schoolboys throughout England.
Darwin's commitment was astonishingly intense. He put everything he had into making that theory work, into finding evidence to support it, into discussing it, or at least the facts that what it was based on, with colleagues from all over the world. So his entire life was given to that theory.
In his own garden, he devises a simple test to show that certain insects only go to some flowers. He pours flour on bees to follow where they go. The link between insects and how they pollinate specific flowers, allowing them to reproduce, and from there evolve, will be some of his most profound work.
I do believe, Parslow, that if Mr. Darwin had had a choice, he would have preferred to be born a bee.
He had a terrific understanding of pollinators and the plants that they co-evolve with, enough that he could make predictions that would be borne out 100 years later. He was shown an orchid from Madagascar that had a very long nectar spur, more than a foot long. And Darwin looked at this flower and from this image predicted that a pollinator would be found. It would be a hawk moth, and it would have a proboscis, a tongue, long enough to reach the bottom of the nectar spur, a tongue a foot long. Naturalists of the time that were only familiar with hawk moths from Europe that have a very short proboscis thought that the idea was laughable. And the hawk moth was not identified until the 1950s or so 100 years after Darwin's book was published. But when the proboscis was unrolled, it was a foot long. It was long enough to reach the bottom of the nectar spur. It's very difficult, actually, to appreciate how radical Darwin's ideas were at the time.
But as Darwin obsessively gathers more evidence, far away on the other side of the world, an obscure collector, Alfred Russel Wallace, has been looking at the world around him and pondering many of the same ideas as Darwin.
Alfred Russel Wallace is one of the most remarkable human beings and phenomenon in the whole history of science. He's a man as interesting as Darwin. He grows up without any scientific background. Orthodoxy meant nothing to him. He would take his mind wherever it could run. And that's a very typical autodidact attitude. And sometimes it leads to crazy theories, sometimes it leads to brilliance. And in Wallace's case, I think it led particularly to brilliance.
In 1854, Wallace left England for Southeast Asia, but this was no academic expedition. Wallace's venture was pure business. He supports himself by collecting animals from the wild and then selling them to scientists and institutions around the world. In his 8 years in the Indonesian islands, Wallace made 700 separate voyages, covered 22,000 kilometres, and collected over 125,000 different specimens. What's more, Wallace is interested in evolution.
Wallace converted to evolution without having a theory. It was just kind of one of the things you converted to if you were a radical young man in the 1840s. So Wallace took on evolution and went out looking for a theory.
One of the ways that Wallace is different from Darwin, Hooker, Huxley, is that instead of just popping in and visiting nature in the wild in the southern hemisphere, he lives in it, he immerses himself in it. He's seeing this kind of enormous parade of nature in front of his eyes. Goes into Borneo and starts collecting orangutans. He wants to know how they live in nature, their behaviour. One of the things he is immediately saying is these animals are related to man. Going bang, straight in where everyone else feared to tread.
In Sarawak in February 1855, Wallace takes a significant step. He writes a paper exploring evolution and is involved in all the same topics that have long enthralled Darwin: geology, fossils, plant and animal distribution, and even the most difficult of all, the formation of new species.
Every species has come into existence coincident with both time and space, with a pre-existing closely allied species.
In effect, he's saying, without explicitly saying, you will see the descent from one species to another, always in the same place with various forces at play. He didn't know what caused it at that time, but he's announcing that evolution is an indisputable fact.
But what Wallace lacks is what Darwin already has: a way of explaining how evolution actually happens. His theory is built around natural selection, or survival of the fittest. Back in England, Charles Darwin reads Wallace's paper but doesn't take it seriously. However, Sir Charles Lyell, the eminent geologist, is alarmed by the similarity of their theories and advises his good friend that he should see it as a possible threat.
In fact, this Wallace is the same chap that's been sending me some bird skins from Sarawak. In response to my wanted letter, I sent him a nice little note. He had an idea of the territory I'm working in.
Charles, I think you should take this Wallace paper as a warning sign. You see, when I talk to some of the young bloods at the Philosophical Club, fixed species are a thing of the past, but they have no clear creed to substitute, and you do. You have proof. You need to publish, Charles, before someone else does.
Darwin realises the time has come. He must summon the courage and publish his thoughts no matter what. But first, he must test himself and his arguments with his friends and supporters to reveal any weaknesses.
Tom, I want to show you something.
This time, he turns to pigeons, yet another branch of his wide-ranging research. Darwin argues that man has changed them enormously by selective breeding. He calls this artificial selection and maintains it mirrors what nature does in the wild with natural selection, his key to evolution.
I've met the breeders, very skillful men.
Natural selection is just a marvelous extension of what Darwin knew, that human intervention by artificial selection could lead to enormous changes. But if the same process occurred in nature, then environmental conditions could act in the same general way as humans deliberately selecting for certain traits.
What I now understand they're doing is selecting and exploiting tiny chance variations among the pigeon offspring, until they end up with these exotic creatures.
He was testing his theory out on the eve of beginning to write it up.
We'll have a look.
On people who held the key to the future in science. And Darwin wanted to get their answers and objections. He also wanted to put them on notice as potential advocates in the public arena.
Come, have another surprise.
While Hooker and Huxley support Darwin, ironically, they don't fully agree with his theory of natural selection. Hooker had been the first person Darwin had shown his theory, and later entrusted with his essay. But Hooker wasn't convinced he had proven his case.
Joseph Hooker is a natural skeptic, so he's inclined to go along with the creationist idea that species are essentially fixed. And that's the point of resistance, really. But in fact, he's gradually persuaded.
One always leaves down a house with a list of questions that take weeks to complete. Next.
But Huxley will prove a tougher nut to crack.
Huxley was not by nature inclined to be interested in ideas of evolution. He's interested in the anatomy, of the structure of species. He saw no such law of development at all. And so he's intrinsically inclined to be hostile to the idea of evolution.
Well, let me put it this way, Tom. The modern horse. Why are you so resistant to the idea that it might be descended from the ancient horse fossil with its 3 toes? Then we have fossils for the 2-toed beast, now today's horse on its single toe.
I won't abide progressionist bunk. Owen's Ascent of Life business. nature has progressed.
Ah, but you see, I too detest Darwin's thinking.
Intermediate forms are missing.
There are fossils under the ocean, under mountainsides. We have only just begun to uncover a tiny fraction of those available to us.
Even ancient fossil animals have living relatives that have undergone little or no change. Fossil history does not mirror an individual's embryonic growth.
Well, as you know, that is not altogether my view.
3 weeks later, he announces, I'm going to begin a book, at that stage called Natural Selection. He then watches very closely the publications and announcements of Hooker and Huxley, and he sees more and more little hints that they're at least interested, that the subject should be examined. He needs them on side because he knows he's lost the establishment. The old guard will never rally to him.
But despite his doubts, within a few weeks, Huxley is calling for a rethink on evolution by the scientific establishment. He is speaking for the new age.
If one assumes instead that species arise by natural laws, there can be no doubt that some form or another of that hypothesis, called the theory of progressive development, will by far present the most satisfactory solution. The whole subject of variation requires a thorough reinvestigation.
Huxley's aim in life was to improve Britain, to take Britain from the rural society it had been in the 18th century and point it in the direction of the urban society that it became in the 20th century. And I think that Huxley saw evolution could be the kind of ideology that would support Huxley's reforming vision of this new technological world.
To take up an issue like Darwinism fitted him perfectly. It was an ideal moment for Huxley as well as for Darwin. The relationship was just great. Darwin appreciated having such an upfront defender.
He gets up the nose of the establishment. And so he delights in it. He delights in the way it infuriates Richard Owen to the point where his capillaries are about to burst.
The analogy I like to use is that Huxley to Darwin is as St. Paul was to Jesus. That without St. Paul, it's very improbable that we would have the Christianity that we have today. And I would say that without Huxley going out there and preaching evolution, I'm not saying that we wouldn't have evolution, but we certainly wouldn't have Darwinian evolution.
On the 14th of May 1856, Charles Darwin embarks on the long and meticulous process of writing his enormous book of evolution. But his obsession for detail as he writes, corresponding with pigeon fanciers, fur trappers and zookeepers around the world, is going to be his undoing.
This book, Natural Selection, I suspect, would never have been finished. That is, he was trying to be absolutely authoritative, to pile on every single piece of evidence. It's an impossible task and full of pain for him, because he was so anxious. He thought he had to have every single fact before he went out. And he was screaming, "This is going to kill me. I can't do it. I'm ill, I'm tired, I'm exhausted, this is overwhelming." And so really, I think he's in crisis.
But it's nothing compared to what Darwin faces on a summer's morning in June 1858, when he receives a letter from Alfred Russel Wallace, the collector whose paper Darwin ignored 2 years earlier. Something he's about to regret bitterly. In those 2 years, Wallace travelled incessantly in the Malay archipelago, collecting and thinking about evolution. But he had not yet found what drives it, Darwin's natural selection. But in February 1858, while delirious as he suffered a bout of malaria, Wallace's mind unlocks the evolutionary puzzle. In a moment of fevered brilliance, he sees his version of natural selection.
The life of wild animals is a struggle for existence. the full exertion of all their faculties is required to preserve their own existence and provide for that of their infant offspring.
And then it comes to him, the Malthusian struggle for existence. And he writes it out on about 20 pages of handwritten, simple explanation for how this works, using natural selection, as we now call it, as the core explanation for evolution.
Wallace addresses it to Charles Darwin, the only naturalist he knows who's interested in the evolution of species. It takes 4 months for Wallace's letter to reach Darwin, and a moment for him to realise that 20 years of work now means nothing. Next,
Papa! Papa!
For the love of God, will you do as you're told?
it started with vestiges.
Please, just leave me be.
Now this.
And who's this Wallace when he's at home?
He's a collector.
But Darwin's friends and supporters will not give up.
Darwin needs to establish priority over Wallace. He needs to write a short paper of his work to date.
He won't write short. He says it can't be done without including all the supporting evidence.
It's a fight they're not prepared to lose.
Mr. Bennett.
Such honors.
These men will rally behind Darwin as he faces more devastating blows. The race to publication will be one of the greatest challenges Darwin faces, but he will not be alone.
If I must make a choice, I should be proud to acknowledge the ape over one who has received a scholastic education.
It is patently obvious that the Archbishop has never read the book.
But the publication of Origins is just the beginning of the scandalous controversy Darwin is yet to face.
I am trashed in every possible way. We all three are.